So we want to start here on this new tape talking about the debate of the Constitutional Convention once the Connecticut Compromise came up from August 6th through September 10th. Very specific provisions were hammered out. The big issue now was decided. They were going to let the small states have the vote in the Senate, equal vote for each state, and the large states would be a proportional vote in the House of Representatives. And so they'd hammer that out, and they'd also determine what they were going to do about slavery. Ironically, the South wanted the slave vote to count, so they were kind of saying, hey, we want the slaves to be counted as people, and that's going to benefit our voting in the House of Representatives. And ironically, the northern states who wanted to try to block that, who felt the South would get too many votes, didn't want the slave vote counted, which indirectly said they didn't want the slaves counted as people for the vote. So you found strange twists as you worked this out politically, but they had this compromise, and they were happy with that. And so people, not totally happy, but they felt like it was a doable thing. So a nation like the United States now is stumbling on into trying to, work together and rid the country of slavery. And you see two provisions here that are quite important. So the debate took place, and in that debate, several things were determined. Number one, the debate said, and they agreed that they would have a 2-year term for representatives. So the representatives of the people, directly voted by the people, would have a 2-year term. And that made them very accountable because they wanted more than just a 1-year term. They wanted a little more longevity, more stability than just a total overturn of Congress every 2 years. So every 1 year. So they went to 2 years, and they felt like that was a good compromise. A second thing was that they made a 6-year term for Senate. And so these senators would be elected for a 6-year term. And oh, by the way, they were not elected popularly. They weren't elected indirectly through the representatives in the House. No, the senators from each state, and there were 2, were both nominated and elected by the state legislatures. And the state legislature could decide to do it any number of ways, but most of them, and I think all of them at the beginning, had the senators decided on by kind of the strong political figures behind closed doors. And these were men and women in the legislature of each state. So the states really determined, and the senators strongly represented the priorities of the states and the concerns of the states. They were elected and really appointed by the legislature, and so they were acquainted with the mineral resources and the very important issues that the legislature in the states was concerned with. So they didn't have to be appealing to the voters. They didn't have to be someone who was popular. They had to be someone who the political people felt would represent those interests well. And so that's an interesting provision. Now that was changed in 1916 with the 17th Amendment. And the 17th Amendment made the senators voted into office by popular vote. So that was changed by an amendment. A third thing they agreed on was a 4-year term for the president. It's interesting to read the debates on this and feeling that, we don't want a tyrant, we don't want anyone with too much power, so we're going to make him accountable to the states through the Electoral College. We're going to really say he has to be a person who appeals to the nation as a whole, and so the Electoral College, which is a group casting their votes from each state, and by getting the majority of that vote, we will be guaranteed that the president will be someone who represents the totality of America, has the broadest appeal. And the president will have to go out to those localities to campaign and to learn about those states as well. Number 4, the power of Congress to regulate foreign trade. And so this becomes one of the important responsibilities, and also interstate commerce. So Congress is given that under in this debate. And fifthly, there's a prohibition of bills of attainder, prohibition. They're going to prohibit bills of attainder, and they're going to prohibit ex post facto laws as well. Ex post facto laws. So these are all things that come out of this debate. And they reach a final approval on September 17th. So often you'll hear September 17th is known as Constitution Day. And there in Philadelphia, they vote, and of the 55 men that attended, who were delegates from different states, of course, remember, Rhode Island never came, but from the other 12 states, only 42 remained. Lots of them had gone home. At one point, the entire New York delegation went home. Alexander Hamilton was there, and the other two men, Lansing and Yates, were both troubled that it seemed that too much authority was going to the executive power, and so or to the national government, so they left, and they wrote a book. They wrote Proceedings of the Constitution as well, and felt like it was really going to undo the state authority, and they were concerned about the power that would be lodged in that national government. And Hamilton himself left for a time because he couldn't vote. He was the only one there on the delegation, and I guess they had a rule, I'm not sure, but they must have had a rule that you had to have more than just one person representing the state. So he actually left for a time, and then they came back, and Hamilton came back to sign. But 42 remain. Now, of those 42, only 39 approved the Constitution. There were 3 that were there. They remained there and they participated, but they refused to sign. And these men refused to sign really on the basis that the Constitution did not have adequate protection for individuals. It really needed a Bill of Rights added to the document. And so there were 3 people. The first one is known as the father of the Bill of Rights. His name is George Mason, and he's from Virginia. He's the father of the Bill of Rights. Number 2 was Luther Martin of, I think it was Delaware. Excuse me, I'm going to try to spell his name correctly. Luther Martin. And the third was from New York. I made a mistake. I meant to say that Elbridge Gerry of New York was concerned as well. Excuse me, he was from Massachusetts, not New York. Excuse me again. And then thirdly, we had Randolph of Virginia. So Edmund Randolph did not support the Constitution. Now later, when the Virginia ratifying convention meets, Randolph is swayed to support the Constitution. And in Virginia, the ratification convention approved the Constitution by just 10 votes. So it was, I think, 179 to 169 was the vote. So you can see how close it was. There were many, including Patrick Henry, who led the anti-federalist fight against ratification of the Constitution because it did not have adequate protection in a Bill of Rights. So that's one thing that sometimes the anti-federalists would vote for the Constitution with the understanding that it would be immediately amended, and it was. In the very first Congress, I was going to say Patrick Henry, nope. James Madison sponsored the amendments and proposed 12 amendments for the Constitution, which he called the Bill of Rights. 10 of those amendments were approved, and those are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So the final document was signed, 39 signatures, and as Franklin emerged from the Hall of Independence Hall there in Philadelphia, he, of course, was struggling. He could hardly walk. He had tremendous gout problems, and he got close to getting into his sedan chair that was carried by 4 men, kind of like a taxi on human feet. And he got ready to get in, and a little lady came up and said, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of government do we have?" And he said to her, "A republic, if you can keep it." So a very sobering reminder that we have a responsibility to keep. And that's why you guys, I'm sure, are taking this class, because you want to be and have a greater influence and a greater understanding. So I want to commend you. Now, there's biblical principles, which you see on the sheet before you, that are embodied in the Constitution. The first one is the principle of form and power. And I would just encourage you to jot down these ideas as we talk, but the principle of sowing and reaping is really important here. The fact is that you just can't snap your finger and have a republic that will work. There are things behind that. There's something that has been sown in the people's lives, or what we would call the power that's behind the form. The form of government is what you reap. Okay, so what is that power that's sown? And I would just, your book goes into a lot of detail on this, so this is a good section, particularly on page 184 of your book. It goes into a lot of detail, but the Christian religion is part of this power that's behind it. Christians who are, for instance, active in looking at candidates and evaluating them and not voting for poor candidates, but even running for office themselves so that there be good candidates that would be caring for the people and not after personal gain. Christian virtue, or what we would call Christian character. So beliefs that had permeated our culture. There was also a character. There was the character of the people, a character that really would not be bent easily to just gaining things for themselves. Abraham Lincoln, a century later, went to a friend that he had met, an older man named Bunce, And Mr. Bunce in Lincoln's district was someone he often gave Abraham Lincoln great advice. And Bunce told Lincoln and just reiterated to him on a number of occasions how important it was not to vote yourself largesse or benefits from just because you can, or because there's a need there, or there's a perceived need. It needs to be the right thing to do. And so Lincoln was very careful and very conservative as congressman and also as our president. But that's part of that character, not just trying to line something with ease, but being careful with that. Thirdly, there was a biblical worldview. The book goes into the elements of a lot of that biblical worldview, but what is a biblical worldview? It's like the glasses that you look through as you look at the world. Okay? So what are the glasses that you look through? Well, if you're looking at it through the Bible and through the truth of the Bible and the ideas and the philosophy of the Bible, and realizing, for instance, that God sees everything, God knows everything, that your character and your doings need to be governed by the Bible, by God, that you can't get away from that, God is above all things. So that's part of your biblical worldview, and that's going to help govern you as a citizen in this republic. Another precept here is point B, that we are a republic, not a democracy. And a republic is the rule of the people. Okay, the rule of the people. But here's the catch: through elected representatives. So it's very important to realize that you're electing representatives, and these are representatives that are elected by the people. And so they're elected. So how does that differ from a democracy? A lot of people think, well, America is a democracy because we are ruled by the people, which is true. We are ruled by the people. But the way we're ruled by the people, it's a simple majority vote. And a lot of people think that's true. There's just a majority vote in the halls of Congress and in the various branches of government. And that is very untrue. You can have a bill that's passed in Congress, and then it gets to the president, and one person, the president, votes it down. He vetoes the bill. Well, how's that fair? That's not ruled by the people. Yeah? We're not ruled by the people. We're ruled by the people through elected representatives. Okay? So the idea is that this majority vote, sometimes this is called 51% majority. Sometimes it's called tyranny of the majority, because the majority can exert a powerful influence over the minority. In fact, the majority can vote and take the minority's rights away. So what's going to protect the minority? Well, you devise checks and balances, you devise state power, federal power, local power, what we would call federalism. You devise a number of ways that a bad bill, a bad piece of legislation can be defeated. And it's not just simply people voting and being ruled by the people by majority vote. Okay? No, a republic says that you have a number of ways that there's protections set in the government. So let's take a look at three of those things that define a republic. Number one, we've mentioned already, representation. So a republic has to have representation. You have to have the people voting for a representative. Okay, now if someone decides to call off elections, we've got a crisis and we're not going to be able to have elections this year, red flag. Wow, that is a bad sign. You never call off elections. You always have. Do you realize that during World War II, we had all of our elections? Do you realize that nothing stopped the elections in World War II? So it's very, very important. Number two, federalism. Federalism is different levels of power, different levels. So we have, in a sense, like a big pyramid. We have local on the bottom, we've got county, we've got state, we've got national power. And so the people are at the very bottom of this pyramid, and these local governments, city, villages, whatever, they are most close to the needs of the people, and that's the closest government. Now, the things that the local can't do, those get put up to the county. So I've kind of putting the county as that second level. And then the things the county can't do go to the state, so they have the state level. And then the things that the state cannot do are done by the national government. You can see little dots in that top. And so the federal government, I think better called the national government, is really the smallest part. I mean, it's that little pyramid at the top is the smallest area of government. And so these levels of jurisdiction, each level does something different. So the local level cannot call out the military to repel an invasion. No, that's only the national government that can do that. The county does not do things that the city does. There's a division of responsibilities there, and we call that jurisdiction. So you have to have those different levels of jurisdiction. Number three, you also have separation of powers. So we have power of government is separated into three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. So there's three branches, and each of these branches serve to put a check and balance on the other branches. We have checks and balances from one branch to another. So as an example, let's say a bad law gets passed, it's an unconstitutional law, and Congress somehow passes it through, and it gets through the House and the Senate, goes to the President approves it, signs the bill. Well, guess what? There's a check. We can have the Supreme Court bring that bill to light, and they might proclaim that it is unconstitutional. We go through a court hearing, and it can be brought as an unconstitutional idea. So, for instance, slavery was found to be unconstitutional by the 13th Amendment in 1865, and there's where you have an example. The Supreme Court reverses previous laws. There's checks and balances. I hope that we'll see one day Roe versus Wade, a terrible Supreme Court decision, 1973, reversed, that there'll be another law, another ruling that will come up. The Supreme Court will approve a law from Congress that bans abortion. And so I hope that we will see a reversal of that. So, so we have a number of things here that define us as a republic. We're not a democracy. Now, the third item there, Christian self-government. Of course, self-government is so important in a republic because government is not to replace the responsibilities of the people. but the government is to do things that the people themselves cannot do. So, for instance, judicial system would be something that government, it's a legitimate realm. It's to protect the people. It's to protect us from invasion of a foreign power. So military would be another one. Things like interstate highways, things that go from state to state, might be a legitimate area for government. You have to be careful because those can become work projects, and they can just become where the national government does work. But if they're needed, and if it truly is something that is protection and the safety of the people, it's an effective area of ministry of the federal government. So Christian self-government really is the root. Without this, we are not going to exist as a republic very long. Why? Well, if you look at the three elements here, people don't go out and vote in good people, we got problems. If these different levels, if people aren't self-governed and they allow these levels of jurisdiction to overlap, we've got waste and we've got corruption. And then think of that self-government when it comes to the separation of powers. Each branch has to stay within its boundaries. Let's say the president does something crooked, like, say, during Watergate, and tries to hide a problem, and the president is not executing the laws. Well, that's a lack of self-government, and you can see where then, your government kind of comes to a standstill, and there's a lack of trust. So self-government is a very much needed, and government is very simply control, direction, regulation, and restraint of something by another. So who is governing you? Who's giving you restraint? Is it God? Is it your own ideas? What is it? Who is controlling you? Who's directing you, regulating and restraining you? Well, hopefully it's yourself. You are doing that through the Holy Spirit. So often we hear this idea of self-government under God, that without God and His help and His overruling providence and speaking to us and working in our hearts, we cannot truly be self-governed. We need God.